Yeah, they don't come much cheaper.
Anyhow, we're staying at the university. It was a free education. So, you people are paying a damn sight more than I had to in my first year. And it's going to be even worse next year by the looks of it. Hell, it might drive me away from university. People just come forward. His room. Right, there are a number of issues on the education front which I'd like to address. The first one concerns overseas students. I'll start with them first. Now, the government seems to believe that why should the New Zealand taxpayer pay for their education? What they don't seem to realise is that overseas students bring a lot of money into this country and they basically pay for it themselves anyway. I'm not happy with their philosophy on the whole thing, and you'll realise that it hasn't worked. In England, where they've tried this, about 1/3 of the numbers came back. So it didn't work at all. They thought, right, we're going to make a profit out of overseas students. We're going to charge them $10,000 and reap all the benefits, because they seem to think, well, you know, if there's 400 in Auckland, for example, at 10,000, that's a lot of money we can make out of them. The only problem is, of course, is that they don't come back, because $10,000 isn't enough. Well, it's too much for them. It isn't enough for the government, and it's not worth what their education is, because this Auckland University isn't going to provide anything special. What we're worried about on other issues concerning overseas students is the fact that you have to be a government aid student to afford to come here. What the government is doing is giving students, some overseas students, a grant. However, there are other students, like Malaysian students, who may not be seen to be in line with their government, and they're not going to get any assistance at all. So those are the students that we're really concerned about. The other thing that worries me, hang on, maybe, stop that. The other thing that worries me is this graduate tax system. Now, in Australia, you might not be aware of it, but they tried to bring in a graduate tax in May, and they had quite large protests. Of course, it didn't come over here because they squashed the media coverage in Australia, so we didn't hear anything about it. The only reason why we managed to get told is because NZ USA had to go over there and find out what actually happened. The graduate tax system does not work. It will not work. All it will do is encourage students to go overseas. If we think hard, the government has said that they are going to pay $20 million to students this year, or for the universities for next year, I should say. What they haven't done is they haven't told us that they're probably going to cut this year's budget by about $9 million towards education. So it's a net increase of $11 million. Now that's better than nothing, I suppose, but the only problem with that, of course, is that there's nothing happening this year, and that we've got no room for students. If the $11 million that they're supposedly going to give to the university to build buildings isn't going to be of any effect to us until about 3 or 4 years' time when these buildings come along. So in the interim, we're going to have course restrictions, enrolment limitations, and then the fees are going to go up. So that's the worst thing about the whole thing, right, is that you're looking at $190, I think it was, this year for a full-time student with a bursary. Next year, you could be looking at something like $840. Speak up. Now, that's if you've got a bursary, because the government is thinking of reducing your fees bursary to zero, all right? At the moment, they pay 75% of your tuition fees. Well, next year, it's going to be nothing. So you're going to have to pay the lot. What is even worse on top of that is the fact that they are not giving you a government subsidy for summer work, all right? So it's going to be harder for us to get jobs for you. Now, we've already got some job search people out there working like crazy trying to get jobs for you for summer. But the employers just aren't going to be able to afford to have students on over the summer because they're not getting the subsidy from the government. Now, they've saved themselves $5.5 million on that, and they've said that they're going to give it to us in the form of a youth allowance. Well, that's a load of crap, because a lot of you will not even qualify for the additional assistance on the youth allowance because your parents earn too much. They took a figure from 1984 as the average wage and said, we're going to apply.
Here is too important for me to stand up here and just waffle, okay? So, my name is Ella Henry, and like everybody else that's here, I'm really concerned about my future at university. Now, for me, that's because I'm one of those stereotypes, you know, like a working class Māori solo mother, and we're the ones that are going to be the most affected by the implications of increased fees and more restricted entry criteria. and graduate taxes, that's another thing that frightens me. Now, the whole direction of these trends is frightening for me, mainly because I'm one of those stereotypes, but also because as a New Zealander who really cares about my country, I don't see anything particularly constructive about the direction that we're headed in as a country. Thank you. At the Cost Recovery March last year, I talked about how I come from a culture that looked on the education of its young as a sacred obligation. But education was also seen as an essential survival strategy for the tribe because a skilled and able population enhance and strengthen a culture. 1 year down the track and we're still fighting a battle against a tunnel-visioned economic drive which perceives tertiary education as a burden and students as potential sources of revenue. We are going to be penalised for attempting to gain the skills which will help us to make a more positive contribution to our society. This is particularly true for Māori people, and we will be among the first to be the most severely affected by these policies, unless we're prepared to come to the universities as the basket charity cases and further widen the gap between our peoples. I know it's a tired old cliche and hopelessly naive, but I'd really like my daughter to grow up in a country where education is free and fully funded, while the military have to run cake stalls to raise money for their toys. By being here today and in other centres around the country, we are saying to the universities, to the government and to the whole country, hey, we might be a burden on the community while we're students, but the payoff when we graduate will benefit all of us. Kia kaha e hoa.